Today we are talking about the DJI RS4 Mini, and we're also talking about the Sony 16mm 1.8. These things hit YouTube and Instagram and literally flooded everyone's timelines, or whatever you call it, the feed. For me personally, it wasn't a good time, but ultimately the question is this: are these products made for professionals, or are they more akin to content creators? For me, the answer is these are not professional pieces of equipment, and that is really coming down to what you define as being professional. Ultimately, if we're saying that you get paid to do video or photo, and we're talking about you're getting paid $250 for a 1 to 2 minute recap video that you're filming with an iPhone or an Osmo Pocket 3, or maybe even like 500 with a ZV-1, or maybe an FX3 or an A7 IV. Technically, it is professional, but what I'm talking about is more akin to onset of productions, because there is this now gray area where the old days of production are dying, which is actually a good thing in my opinion. And then you have the new normal, which is about 5 to 8 people running a crew, and everyone's giving a little bit of insight into creativity on how we can achieve the shot that we originally set out to achieve in the given environment that we're in. And to me, that is what I consider like professional. If you are a photographer that does real estate photos, yes, you're a professional real estate photographer that also offers a $250 add-on for walkthroughs or maybe social media, and you are a professional real estate videographer. That is something that absolutely falls underneath this 16mm, because a lot of people use the Laowa 10mm, and this is really going to complement that very well. However, the type of professional I'm talking about is on set, typically with commercial or corporate productions. Are you going to find these pieces of equipment there? And that's why I'm saying the answer is no, because the RS4 Mini it's still a Mini, and I'm a little bit sore about the RS3 Mini. When I got it, all the influencers baited me. They were literally like, hey, you can throw 24 to 70 on here and it'll hold. And it's like, yeah, if you don't zoom it, then it will hold and be balanced properly. But the moment you start to zoom it, it starts to put more pressure on the motors. And I'm not saying that's happening with the RS4 Mini, because I'm sure they beefed up the motors in order to withstand that. But even with those extended arms, you're not going to have nearly as much play. Like I'm constantly throwing on the Tamron 70 to 180 or the Sony 70 to 200 f2.8. You're going to need a little bit more space. And honestly, the RS4 now has enough room on the arms where you can absolutely get away with that in a professional environment. And even more so, it's going to have that hot swappable battery, which is, having an internal battery isn't a great thing when you're running and gunning on set, because if you run out of battery, you're either going to need a whole new unit, or you're going to have to hook it up to a fast charger and hope that you're going to have enough battery to get through the end of the day. Here's the thing though, I really like the color on the RS4 Mini and wish they would bring that to the RS4 and RS4 Pro. Hopefully whenever they release the RS5, I'm sure that they'll add the gray and the black. I don't know, DJI is really weird with colors, and they typically don't add combo packs. Like with the DJI mic, you can get a white transmitter, but you can't get it in a pack with like a white case and a white receiver and all those things. I really wish that they would do more of that, because I actually really like the gray color on these newer gimbals. It catches my eye a little bit more. And ultimately, with the upgraded tracking module, right, this little AI device that snaps on, and in this case it's a magnet, you can also add it on to the RS4 and the RS4 Pro. They put a USB-C port on the back of the arm, which you hook in, and then you snap it on the underside of it with the RS4 and the RS4 Pro. And, it's a really cool introduction, but you don't need to get the RS4 Mini to get it. You can buy it as like a $69 or $75 add-on to the RS4, the RS4 Pro, and buy it separately. So it's not like you're negated from using it if you're using the RS4 or RS4 Pro. And clearly, when they added that port on the back, they knew what they were doing. They already knew that they were going to release it way ahead of time. Here's the kicker is like, yes, the footprint is smaller on this thing when you compare it to an RS4 or a Pro, but the fact that you can rip the handle off, and I know that the arms alone are probably going to be like the size of this thing, but when I'm loading out in a backpack or something like that, I'm going to probably keep the handle on or break it off. So to me, it becomes more annoying, because if I need to break it down and put it into a backpack, it's just not gonna work the way I need it to work. The same way as I can pop off the battery, put the arms here, put the battery and the tripod and the hand grip here. And then 9 times out of 10, if I'm not coming with the gimbal fully built, I'm coming with a gimbal in a case, a travel case, which is going to have everything I need. And then I'm going to have my external monitor with me that I'm going to be hooking up to the back of it. So truth be told, the small form factor is cool, but I don't necessarily know if it's better than just trying to pack up the RS4 on its own. My main beef with the mini series is the fact that the way the arms are, they don't allow enough leeway for you to do the FPV mode. So when you're like double gripping it and going to the side, and then you start to move to the other side. On the RS3 Mini, there tended to be a jerk, and I'm willing to wager and bet that on the RS4 Mini, that jerk is still apparent versus when you throw it on an RS4 Pro, which even the RS4 has a little bit of a problem with it when you put it into the FPV mode and it opens up the roll axis with the camera, where I found it on the RS3 at least, where when you start to roll and twist, it'll start to jerk because it can't quite keep up with the movements when you have the deadband set to high and you're trying to make it very smooth. And to be honest, if I were to use this in a pro setting, I guess I'd probably use it in a documentary style setting where I need to be really cramped in. I also know that I'm not really going to be able to reliably make the movements I need to make, especially on a 28 to 75 or a 24 to 70, based upon which direction you're going with either the Sigma, the Tamron, or the Sony. It's one of those things where I don't have the opportunity to get the shot again if I'm out doing doc style stuff or if I'm just grabbing B-roll in a corporate setting. I can, of course, coach the person, but if I have to continually do it 3-4 times because the gimbal isn't doing what I need it to do, it's going to make the talent upset and they're going to be like, come on, can we get this over with? It becomes frustrating. And that's what happens when you go cheap on equipment. It is literally what I ran into when I got the RS3 Mini, and it's what I ran into when I got the RS3 by itself, which is why I still use my RS2, which is the same size as the RS3 Pro, because the naming scheme was a little bit weird back then. They did the RSC2, which is like the smaller version, which is equivalent to the RS3 and 4. And then back then you had the RS2, which is equivalent to the RS3 Pro and 4 Pro. But I found that I'm still relying on my RS2. I have not bought anything new. I was going to get the RS3 Pro, but there was a factory defect with the one that I bought used, and I actually returned it because the guy let me return it. Thank God. But ultimately, that's also why I think if you're going to go with anything for a professional shoot, at least make it an RS4, so you have more leeway with movement. You can break it down very easily, and if you really want that AI tracking module, you can buy it for an additional $69. I mean, if you're doing a small doc where you're like, I don't know, working with doctors or something, you need to be in very tight spaces, and you're going to break it down to literally just be the pistol grip and then just the gimbal and camera and not have a monitor on it, I would still take the RS4 over this in a professional setting. The RS4 Mini is cool, but ultimately for wedding videographers and for content creators, it'll do the job because it's really great for pushes and small pans. But beyond that, you're not going to get the same play out of it that you're going to get from the RS4 or the RS4 Pro. And it's something that a lot of the influencers don't really talk about. Anytime gear's reviewed, there are certain things omitted and left out, or things purposely not checked on the review, or they weren't thinking about it, or they want to make sure that they're on good terms with the company they're reviewing for because there's a financial incentive. Because even if they're not getting paid to do the video, they're going to rack up clicks and then get the opportunity to sell whatever product they have. So it becomes this giant mess. And ultimately, in the marketing material, they have I guess a content creator that's doing like an action sequence on a train where they're like moving around and flying, and it's like, yeah, it's cool, but I don't think practically it's actually going to be used in that kind of environment. And I think that they are taking the best take on that, which is why it's a professional setting in order to really test it. It's not like tried and true in the field. Plenty of wedding videographers love the RS3 Mini. I'm sure they're going to love the RS4 Mini because it's light, easy to set up, and you're not going to kill your arms throughout the day. And that's fine because all they're doing is push-ins, maybe some small parallax shots on a wide-angle lens pushed in really close to something. That's what you need. That's what it's going to be good for. But when you need something to do everything, this is not going to be that use case. So if you're asking me, I would recommend getting at the bare minimum an RS3 or an RS4. And honestly, the RS3 is a little bit dodgy, so I'd probably go with the RS4. An RS3 Pro versus an RS4 Pro, just go with the RS3 Pro. I mean, unless you're doing a ton of vertical content and you really need that native clip on and off. Honestly, they have the DJI vertical mount, which I use. All you have to do is pop off the other thing, pop that on, and rebalance it. It's almost all the way balanced anyways when you pop it on. It's just a matter of getting the level right up and down. So it's, 6 to 1, half the dozen the other. By no means do you need the RS4 Pro unless you need that advanced ecosystem with a new LiDAR detector and all that goodness. The majority of people I know aren't really going to use those things, nor are they going to use the LiDAR with the lenses that they're rocking. They're usually going to use autofocus lenses when you're doing, even on some of these higher end commercial shoots, you're not really seeing like super cinema glass there. There are some individuals I work with that run companies that literally use strictly the Cooke SP3s, and they're trying out different lenses. Been able to try the Nissi Athenas, the Dizios. They're all good lenses, but it all comes down to what you really need. And if you want that extra character without having to bake it in after the fact digitally, or you do want it baked in with the image itself, you can do that. But ultimately, I think you're fine with an RS3 or an RS4. Honestly, opt in for the RS4 if you're going there, and then get the RS3 Pro unless you really need that expanded ecosystem, which, that's very specialized with doing car shots and crane shots and jib shots. And even then, the RS3 Pro does have a lot of functionality there. Moving on to the 16mm, the Sony 1.8 16mm. It's a G lens, not a G Master, and obviously it's right next to that 20mm lens that everyone's been comparing it to. A lot of people are noting the fact that there's less distortion on the 20mm, which is to be expected because 16mm is super wide. So you're going to start to see that barreling and bowing within the middle and start to get that distortion because it's a super wide angle lens. That's just what happens with them. Now, this is a very niche lens, specifically for that vlogging style look. There are a few use cases, quote unquote, professionally I would see it used for, which would be astrophotography, real estate photography, real estate videography, and high-end architectural work. For everything else, the 16 to 35, or even realistically the 16 to 25 G lens is going to get you what you need to do. If you're using an A7 IV, you might need the 1.8 when you're shooting in a darker environment or doing run and gun, but ultimately, if you're pairing it with an FX3, a ZVE1, an A7S III, or an FX6, you have that second base ISO of 12,800, which is only taking a small hit on dynamic range. So you can really rely on that on the 16 to 25 2.8, which is what my recommendation would be to get over this. And I know it's 400 extra bucks or something like that, but ultimately you're covering 16, you're covering 20, and you're covering 24, which are three really good ultra wide focal lengths from a 16 to 25. You're covering a very wide net. You're not getting the same reach as, the 17 to 28 Tamron or the 16 to 35 Sony. The 16 to 35 G Master 2 is a beast. That's why it cost like $2,500, $2,900, whatever it cost, because of how big that range is and how clean the optics are throughout that whole zoom range. Obviously, that wouldn't be comparing to apples here. It's comparing apples to oranges. That's why I'm bringing up the 16 to 25, because we are talking about a prime versus zoom lens. And ultimately, the 16 to 25 optically is not much worse than the 16mm prime lens. You're getting a lot for it. You're getting that ultra wide angle lens. If you're doing real estate, I honestly would rather take the 16 to 25 any day of the week over just strictly being stuck at 16mm. I used to do some video walkthroughs stuck at 14mm, and there are some times where I wish I could have zoomed in. I mean, I had the Tamron 17 to 28, but it's not quite the same quality you're getting out of the Sony 14mm ultra wide. So with this lens, Yet again, I mentioned the professional use cases you would have for it, but ultimately, if you are a content creator and literally vlogging professionally and have 50 to 100,000 users, and it's like your main source of income, this lens will be great for you. It is content creation is a different form in production altogether. And typically, the way that you produce content for yourself versus the way you produce content for a client are going to be very, very different. There are some people that have a very distinct style that they use for themselves. They then can do videos for other companies with that same style, it's cool. But very rarely is it going to rely on a 16 millimeter ultra wide lens. And ultimately, if you are using that kind of style for production, the 16 to 25 is really going to get you to where you need to be. Because if we're talking about this, we're usually talking about establishing shots, architecture, real estate, things like that. I'm probably not going to use a 16 millimeter walking through a house focused on an agent. I'd probably punch into closer to a 24, and I have that versatility with that 16 to 25. So I don't think the 16 millimeter 1.8 is a professional lens used on productions, and nor is it going to be. It's not going to be a standout. I think it's very niche and designed for very specific content creators. Sony made it because they have the 20 millimeter and they're like, what we can do is a 16 millimeter. And, if you're doing astrophotography, you're absolutely going to love this lens, I'm sure. 1.8, very clean, nighttime, long shutter speed, time lapses, whatever you need. When we're talking about doing actual commercial and corporate productions, this isn't going to be a very useful lens, and you'd be sinking $800 into a lens that is going to be very limited and niche in what you can do with it versus spending $1,100 if you can find it used, or $1,200, whatever the cost is for the 16 to 25. If you're just starting out, versatility is your best friend. Whatever you can use one piece of gear for, you should be able to use it for 3 to 4 other things, because if you can do that, you're cutting costs as opposed to getting a whole bunch of specialized gear. After you become established and then start creating more and more corporate and commercial productions, then you can dive into the specialized gear and then get your niche. But starting out, you want the most amount of flexibility as possible, and that's what this lens is going to do for you. The 16 to 25, that is. Now, one of the big things they were talking about within the reviews is getting super close and then getting the bokeh after. But to be very honest, it's going to be very small use cases where you're pushing an ultra wide angle lens up to someone's face without creating that comical, over-exaggerated look, which is typically used in cinematography for either someone's becoming unhinged, or it's used in comedies to really exemplify all the ridiculousness of someone's face when it looks that wide. So it is cool to have the 1.8 bokeh, but whether or not it's actually going to be practical in most use cases, I highly doubt it. To be blunt, if you want more of a close focusing distance with lenses too, you can always opt for an extension tube to give you a little bit more play with Tamron 17 to 28 or the 16 to 25. And you still get that autofocus with an extension tube too, though it might not be as good, but still good enough, because obviously the pins work and everything else. But I would not recommend a wide angle lens based upon bokeh. And I think anyone that's telling you that either doesn't understand cinematography or it's a punch list that Sony asked them to highlight. So if you're asking for my recommendation on this, I would not get the 16mm 1.8. Instead, I would get the 16 to 25mm 2.8 to have that baked in versatility and understand that I'm just going to have a few stops less of exposure that I can work with, which isn't that big of a deal with today's cameras. And honestly, you throw it into either Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve Studio and you can throw on noise reduction like it's nothing. So to wrap up the video, a few notations. If we're talking gimbals, I really wouldn't recommend the RS4 Mini unless you're a content creator strictly, or a wedding videographer, or you're just working with a really light loadout. I would rather recommend the RS4 or the RS3 Pro, or honestly, you can get away with the RS2. I still use it personally and does 90% of what I need it to do, so it's very few times of renting out another gimbal for the task at hand. And if you're looking at the wide angle lenses, I would recommend the 16 to 25mm 2.8 over the 16mm to give you that extra versatility, more bang for your buck, while also covering 3 different focal lengths that are absolutely primary for shooting. It is important to understand that technology is advancing very quickly and crews are shrinking down, but production isn't quite the same as content creation yet. It's just these two different things that sit in two different wheelhouses. It's not to say that content creators aren't filmmakers. They absolutely are, being specialized. If you say you're a salesman, well, what do you sell? Are you a real estate agent, or are you an auto sales, or do you do tech sales? These three worlds are very different, and it's the same thing with filmmaking. Filmmakers can live within different niches within an industry. Content creation uses different tools than it does for actual production. And if you're trying to get paid for production work, the 16 to 25 millimeter, the RS4 won't steer you wrong. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.